Dr. Martin Luther King was an extremist for love. He was willing to talk openly and unapologetically about love, and about love as defined as a steadfast commitment to the well-being of others. But don't take it from me. Let's hear it from him.
And one of the great problems of history is that the concepts of love and power have usually been contrasted as opposites, polar opposites. So that love is identified with a resignation of power, and power with a denial of love. Now we got to get this thing right. What is needed is a realization that power without love is reckless and abusive, and that love without power is sentimental and anemic. Power at its best. Power at its best is love, implementing the demands of justice, and justice at its best is love correcting everything that stands against love.
So, the beginning of that. Power without love is reckless and abusive. In our work at the Southern Center for Human Rights, every single day, we see manifestations of reckless and abusive power within our criminal legal system. We see it in our country's addiction to incarceration. We see it in the over-detention of immigrants, people of color, as well as people who are struggling with addiction or mental illness. We see it in the ways that private prisons and probation companies are getting rich off the backs of our most vulnerable. And we see it in the many ways that people, especially brown and black people, who encounter the police are devalued, humiliated, and even killed. One particularly egregious manifestation of this abuse one of the particularly egregious manifestations of an abuse of power is in our nation's use of solitary confinement. In Georgia, harsh and horrible conditions of solitary confinement prompted us to litigate on behalf of men who are trapped inside our notorious special management unit for literally years on end. This is a photo of one of the cells in this unit. You can imagine that it's about the size of a parking space, and our clients were confined there, not for days, not for weeks, not for months, but for years, and in some cases in excess of 10 years. Thanks to your support, and in partnership with our wonderful co-counsel at Kilpatrick Townsend, we were able to reach a groundbreaking settlement challenging the practices of solitary confinement in Georgia this year. And thank you. And with this victory, we will be able to use it to promote change, not just in other prisons around the state, but also in jails. One of our big goals is to end solitary confinement, and with your support, we will do so. But at the Southern Center, we don't take any of our victories for granted, and we know that we must keep pressing forward because there is such great need, and there are so many people out there that are suffering. So this year, we filed a new lawsuit, and this one was on behalf of women with mental illnesses who are being incarcerated at the South Fulton Jail just outside of Atlanta. When you enter this jail, the smell is overwhelming, and it's difficult to breathe. Throughout the jail's pods, women can be found lying on the floor, filthy. Many of the women are entirely unresponsive, and those who are able to speak often mutter incoherently. Some have even held up signs when we've been there begging for help. This picture that is here, you can see one of the women laying on her bed, and you can see the pooling water near the toilet. The toilets and the sinks leak all the time, and the women are forced to use their bedding and their clothes to mop up. Some of our clients have been held in solitary confinement in this place for in excess of 5 months. And even though the offenses that brought them there in the first place are very low-level city ordinance violations and misdemeanors, after a multi-day hearing in federal court in August, a newly appointed federal judge issued an injunction forcing changes at this jail and commenting on the conditions as repulsive and saying that those who are aware of the conditions really ought to have a hard time sleeping at night. Thanks to your support, we can continue to seek justice for those who have been discarded and just forgotten in prison and jails. We also see reckless and abusive power in the ways that our system criminalizes people for being poor and for being people of color. Every single day, we see proof that the way that people experience our legal system varies dramatically depending on the amount of money that they have and the color of their skin. In the city of LaGrange, Georgia, they have this policy where they tied unpaid court fines and fees to utility service. And if you don't pay, you can get your utilities cut off, your water, your electricity. And LaGrange's population is only 48% black, but 90% of the people impacted by this court debt policy are black. And when we saw this, we knew we had to sue. This man pictured is our client, Charles Brewer. He suffers from congestive heart failure, and he needs that machine to live. He got a ticket for driving without a license, and when he couldn't pay his debt on his day of court, they attached the debt to his utility bill, which enormously increased the amount that he had to pay. And then the city went on to threaten Mr. Brewer in writing, on the phone, and in person, saying that he would have his utilities cut off if he didn't pay. This case is working its way through the federal courts, and just 2 weeks ago, the 11th Circuit ruled unanimously in favor of our clients. So this case will continue to go forward, and thanks to your support, we are working to end the criminalization of poverty overall and to dismantle this two-tiered system of justice. We see countless incidents of abuses of power when it comes to our law enforcement. This is particularly problematic when it impacts our youth. And this year, the Southern Center filed a lawsuit on behalf of 65 young people who were arrested while attending a party in Cartersville, Georgia. The police entered the party without a warrant, and when they found a small bag of marijuana and could not pin it to any individual person, they arrested all 65 young people. Some of these people were kept in jail for 3 days. They were kept in isolation. Some were strip searched. Some were threatened with tasers, and they were otherwise humiliated. One of our clients described his treatment was like he was an animal. And 12 days after the arrest, the DA dismissed the charges. But the damage had already been done. These mugshots were all over the news. And so these young people had consequences. They lost jobs. There were military deferments for young men who were getting ready to leave. Kids were kicked off of their basketball teams. Our client, Nija Geider, who's a 22-year-old single mom of a 1-year-old son, just before this arrest, had gotten her life on track. She had gotten a new job at a Mexican restaurant that she was proud of. She had found stable housing. She had even bought her child Christmas gifts. She was feeling really hopeful. She went to this party after a shift at the restaurant and was there less than an hour when she was arrested. She was kept in jail for 3 days, and in that time, she lost her job because her employer saw her mugshot on the news. It took her more than 2.5 months to find new work, and in that time she had to visit food pantries so she and her son could eat. Thanks to your support, we are supporting young people as they stand up for themselves and stand up for their rights to push back on police excesses and abuse. We are continuing our fight against the death penalty and the racism that flows through the entire process. For the past 42 years, Johnny Gates has been languishing in prison after he was convicted and sentenced to death by an all-white jury in Columbus, Georgia. Last year, we discovered new information that shows that prosecutors systematically excluded black prospective jurors. Here are some of the notes that we found. You can see on there that the prosecutors noted the race and the gender of the prospective jurors, referring to white prospective jurors as WM and WF, and as black prospective jurors as NF and NM. But it goes on from there. We found notes that show that they referred to the black prospective jurors in incredibly derogatory ways, like fat, lazy, and con artist. Earlier this year, Mr. Gates' conviction was overturned based on new exculpatory DNA evidence, so Mr. Gates is very likely innocent, to make the whole situation even worse. But And I will say that when the judge ruled this, he noted that the prosecutors clearly engaged in the systematic exclusion of blacks during jury selection, then made racially charged arguments to the all-white juries. But we're still fighting this because the state appealed it. This case is now pending in the Georgia Supreme Court, and we are very hopeful that the court will do the right thing. We also resist racism and mass incarceration by challenging extreme sentences that are the legacy of the war on drugs and that are almost exclusively carried out against people of color. In just a few moments, you'll get to hear a personal story about this. But right now, I want to show you a 2-minute video about our work to free some of these folks and what our clients face after they come out of prison.